This week we'll be talking about cellular respiration, which is the way cells get energy in the presence of oxygen. This chapter will deal with a few different questions. It'll talk about how cellular respiration allows for the harvesting of energy, the different stages of cellular respiration, fermentation, or what happens when oxygen is not available, and connections between metabolic pathways, such as when sugar is not available, how are proteins and fats used to perform these processes? It's important to understand that photosynthesis and cellular respiration are tightly linked. Remember that all of the energy that enters an ecosystem ultimately comes from the sun. Chloroplasts will capture that sunlight and convert it into organic molecules and oxygen. Those organic molecules and oxygen will then be used by the mitochondria to perform cellular respiration. This will produce ATP that is used for cell work. As a byproduct of conversion, this process will release heat, but it will also make carbon dioxide and water, which are used to complete photosynthesis again. Notice how energy moves through the system in a linear fashion. Every time conversion happens, some energy is going to be lost as heat. However, organic molecules like sugars and oxygen are converted into carbon dioxide and water and then back into sugars and oxygen in a cyclical pattern. Usually, when we hear the term respiration, we think about breathing. However, breathing and cellular respiration are not the same thing. Respiration in the breathing sense refers to exchanging gases like carbon dioxide and oxygen, whereas cellular respiration is the aerobic or oxygen requiring harvesting of energy from food molecules by the cell. The first step to getting energy if you're a human being is to eat. Food is chewed up in the mouth and then later digested more by the stomach and the intestines. By the time they reach the small intestines, they've been broken down into large biological molecules. Large carbohydrates are further broken down into glucose by enzymes that are present in the small intestines. Glucose is a large sugar molecule, so it will move into cells lining the small intestines by active transport. This is because we want to get all of the glucose. We don't want to rely on equilibrium and passive transport to make that happen. Glucose then will move out of these cells to blood capillaries by facilitated diffusion. Remember that facilitated diffusion requires the use of a protein. We can use passive transport in this case because the blood capillary will always have less sugar in it than the cells lining the small intestine. In order for cellular respiration to occur, we will also need oxygen. Humans harvest oxygen from the air when it moves into the lungs. This oxygen will move from the lungs into blood capillaries by simple diffusion. Remember that oxygen is a small, uncharged molecule, and that there is always more oxygen in air than there is in the bloodstream. Once glucose and oxygen are present in the bloodstream, they will be transported throughout the body. Glucose will move out of blood capillaries and into body cells by facilitated diffusion, and oxygen will move by simple diffusion. The blood capillaries will always have more sugar and more oxygen than the surrounding body tissue. Cells use the energy from glucose to produce ATP. This starts with glycolysis, and glycolysis takes place in the cytoplasm. Sometimes oxygen isn't available. If that's the case, it goes directly to fermentation, and that's where the reaction will end. This is common in many prokaryotic organisms, some eukaryotic organisms. In fact, your body cells do it occasionally in the case of emergencies. If oxygen is present, then the cell will continue with cellular respiration. This ends with reactions that are present in the mitochondria. There are some prokaryotic cells that do this, but all eukaryotic organisms are capable. So why is this the case? Well, as I mentioned, both of them begin in the cytoplasm with glycolysis. Fermentation reactions are completed there, while cellular respiration reactions are completed in the mitochondria. While fermentation reactions do not use oxygen, cellular respiration reactions do, and fermentation produces 2 ATP molecules of glucose. Now, right now, the number of molecules of glucose per cycle of the reaction doesn't really mean much of anything. But when I tell you that cellular respiration makes 32 ATP molecules instead of 2, that'll give you an idea of just how much more efficient it is. For example, 32 molecules of ATP per molecule of glucose is enough to support things like elephants or giant redwood trees, some of the largest organisms alive. It's also enough to provide ATP for things like flight or for people to run super fast. It's important to remember that getting energy out of glucose is an exergonic reaction, and that all energy conversions will release some energy in the form of heat. In fact, that's why when you exercise, you get hot and you have to sweat. Human beings are actually pretty inefficient. We use about 34% of the energy originally stored in glucose and convert it into ATP. The equation looks like this. For every molecule of glucose, you need 12 atoms of oxygen. This gives you 6 molecules of carbon dioxide, 6 waters, ATP, and heat. This reaction has two major parts. One is the loss of hydrogen atoms from glucose. This converts glucose into carbon dioxide. This step is called oxidation. Those hydrogens are then moved onto oxygen to create water. This step is called reduction. Together, this is called a redox reaction. Essentially, oxidation is the loss of electrons or energy, and reduction is the gain of electrons or energy. That might seem really strange, but it was originally named after the gain or loss of oxygen. So a gain of oxygen was oxidation, and a loss of oxygen was reduction. However, we now understand that it also applies to the movement of hydrogen. Loss of hydrogen or loss of electrons is oxidation. Gain of hydrogen or gain of electrons is reduction. Now that we have a basic understanding of how cellular respiration works, we're going to move on to talk about the different stages of cellular respiration and its differences from fermentation.